Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs. At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, Jo Neal, and Dr. Hannah Thurger. How are you today, Hannah?
Really well. Very excited for this episode as a Bristolian.
Oh, yeah. All hands in Bristol.
I really enjoyed reading the book with all the references to Bristol. So yeah, very excited to have Mike on the podcast.
Brilliant. Yes. Yeah, so today we have a fantastic guest, and he is no stranger to the Drug Science Podcast. In fact, this will be his third appearance on the podcast, which is great. I've just listened to the episode on mescaline, and I really, really enjoyed it. Just re-listened. So that covers the origins and contradictions of drug prohibition, and a very in-depth conversation about mescaline, as a psychedelic being different in its pharmacology from the tryptaminergics, DMT, and psilocybin. Absolutely illuminating. So, listeners, if you haven't listened to that, I would highly recommend it. But today we're discussing Mike's new book. And I would say that Mike is almost as productive as David Nutt with his book writing. I think maybe even outdoing him, but Dave's not here to defend himself, so that's not fair. But yes, yeah, absolutely. Hannah and I have had a bit of a sneak preview. This book is the second edition, and it comes out on the 24th of June. And it's called Free Radicals: How a Group of Romantic Experimenters Gave Birth to Psychedelic Science. Essentially, really a biography of the early scientific and medical pioneers, but obviously we're going to hear a lot more about that from the experts. So, Mike, I'd like to kind of start by asking you why this book, really, why this subject is so important.
All right. Well, hi. It's great to be back, by the way. And this was a subject that I've been interested in for a really long time. As soon as I started looking at the history of psychedelics, which was about 20 years ago, I kind of zeroed in on this moment and this story. And it's the story of the discovery of nitrous oxide, which happened in Bristol, as Hannah said, in 1799, and it was all kinds of firsts. I mean, nitrous oxide was the first kind of psychoactive drug that had been discovered in the laboratory, and so it was just totally staggering that you could synthesize a gas in a laboratory and inhale it, and not only have this kind of really intense euphoria and sensations of pleasure, but also this wild cosmic revelation, this sudden, feeling that you're finally seeing reality for the first time. That's just an extraordinary thing to happen. And the time and place that it happened in and the people who sort of made it happen are so fascinating because, before this, of course, people had taken drugs, usually sort of psychoactive plants, and had written descriptions of them. But this was the first time that a new state of consciousness was really there to be mapped scientifically. And so this was a big kind of group experiment with dozens of people taking nitrous oxide and all writing their descriptions of the experience, trying to describe what it was like and what was happening, and everybody trying to figure out what was going on. How could this be? How could it be that a lungful of this gas produced this incredible sensation that nobody had experienced before? So, and the group of people at this time were very diverse. I mean, there were doctors and there were chemists, but there were also poets and there were philosophers and, a lot of radical politics involved. And everybody coming at this experience from so many different angles, trying to figure out how can we describe this sensation and what does it mean. So I think it's really kind of the origin story of psychedelic science, and that, so I zeroed in on it, as I say, quite early on, and I wrote about it a bit. And then about 15 years ago, I got to write, the book of the discovery, which came out, in 2009, I guess. And I'm very glad and very lucky that my publishers have allowed me to have a second bite of the cherry to go back, revise it a little bit and get it out again.
Well, I think with the psychedelic renaissance going on as it is at the moment, it's very timely.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think when it came out, it was a bit like kind of my personal obsession, but not anybody else's. I mean, I was kind of really interested. I mean, this is before nitrous was a recognizable street drug. It was certainly when I started writing about this, nobody had really heard of it. And also, if you're, that was the time before psychedelics were at all mainstream. So what this basically is like a literary and scientific sort of biography and history, and to try and kind of make that about psychedelics at that point would have been a bit too weird. But now I think it's actually really fascinating, and I'm hoping that'll work really well for both readerships. I'm hoping that people who are coming to this from the point of view of psychedelics will discover all kinds of stuff about the roots of that, and I'm also hoping that people who like kind of literary and scientific sort of biography of that period are going to be really pleased to find the dots being joined with where we are today with psychedelics.
I think for us, Hannah, reading it, it was the meeting of those two aspects.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of just the reminder that so much of early scientific discoveries were through self-exploration, which I guess we've kind of lost now in like modern science. Yeah. And so it's just that kind of inspiring reminder of those real pioneers at the beginning who just went out there and just did it and discovered all these amazing things so early on.
Yeah, that's right. And that's, the last book I wrote, Psychonauts, which I discussed with David here when it came out a couple of years ago, that was all framed around self-experiment. And, because that's one of the things, as soon as you go back before the 20th century, it's like, well, all kinds of people were really interested in the mind and how it worked, and in kind of consciousness and what happened in altered states of consciousness. And if you were interested in those things and you were a doctor or a scientist, it was pretty standard to start off by taking the drug in question and writing about it and describing it as best you could. And, that was the starting point of your research. And, they particularly this story, particularly Humphry Davy, who was the kind of young chemical genius at the center of this, he was really the most inspirational figure for that, because he was 20 when he did this. It was the first thing he really did as a scientist, was to take just enormous heroic doses of nitrous oxide and describe them in amazing detail. And then after that, he went on and he sort of worked with the voltaic pile and discovered new elements and became Sir Humphry and the president of the Royal Society. And everybody always looked back at that and said, well, that was, it was the nitrous oxide experiments. That was when he showed he was a real hero of science, that he was really prepared to go the extra mile and, put himself right out there. And he became a kind of hero, a sort of mascot for self-experiments. So all the way through the period that I was looking at in Psychonauts, everybody's always looking back to Humphry Davy, and especially when people start getting a bit concerned about drugs and sort of, prohibition and addiction and things, then people justify it by saying, well, the great Sir Humphry Davy, of course, look at we're just doing what he did.
Yeah, and can you imagine that happening nowadays?
It's kind of it's very odd, I think, in sort of contemporary psychedelic science, because of course everybody's interested in the subjective experience. That's what it's all about. But the science can't quite encompass that. So the science is all about brain imaging and neurochemistry and all these kind of, which are really just proxies, for the experience, for the subjective experience. But I think we do kind of, there's such hunger for the subjective experience and for those descriptions. I think that's why, people like Michael Pollan's work is so popular, because, the people who are doing the institutional science and, the people he's writing about can't do this, but he can. And I think for a lot of people who are interested in psychedelics, all the neurochemistry and sort of the default mode network stuff is kind of interesting. But what people really want to know is, but what's it feel like when you kind of smoke 5-MeO DMT or something? So I think we still have that fascination, but I think it's just moved a little bit outside the field of science into that peripheral area of, scientific literature or communication or culture.
Yeah, but for the listeners, there's the most brilliant description of Humphry Davy's experience with nitrous oxide. I've got it on page 250. I don't know where it'll be, in the end, but it's absolutely extraordinary and a totally heroic dose that he took. Just extraordinary. And the other thing, there's a lovely description of Humphry Davy drinking a bottle of wine in 8 minutes, I think, and then describing his experience before he was sick, which is really great. I don't know where you found this stuff now.
Yeah, well, that was in the book that he wrote mostly, and some of it is in his correspondence as well. But he had lots of questions to answer. He was a chemist, and so a lot of his book, which was the book that made his name, it's kind of starts with the chemistry. It's like, what is nitrous oxide and how is it different from nitric oxide and what are its properties, and then kind of moves on from that to the biology. How does it get absorbed into the bloodstream, and how can we tell about what's it doing? And then it kind of just segues from that into this bit where this final section where all these people, these experimental volunteers, including people like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, all describe their nitrous oxide experiences, and he puts it all together into sort of one great narrative. And he was so there were lots of reasons why he had to take it, lots of experiments that he had to do, lots of things he had to measure, his sort of pulse and his bloods and all that. But he was also wanted to know what happened if you took more of it, because with alcohol, as you say, if you can get really, really drunk and then you just feel really terrible afterwards. And he was kind of inhaling nitrous oxide and actually having a kind of really sort of wild euphoric time and then feeling okay afterwards. So he was always like, well, what happens if I push it? What happens if I push it further? And one of the many fantastic figures in this circle is James Watt, the famous engineer, and James Watt designed all this apparatus for the inhaling of nitrous oxide and the gases, that kind of just like a thing that you'd like a little stove that you'd have, which would, when you heated crystals and they gave off the gas, you'd put them through a water filter and they'd come out, and he designed this green silk bag which you'd fill with the gas, and so very much like the balloons that people use today. And he also designed a kind of large sort of cabinet thing, which the idea of that was like, if you were trying it on patients who were too weak to kind of hold a balloon up to their lips and inhale, you could just put them in a container filled with all this gas. So that's where Humphry Davy ends up, in this container, being sort of pumped full of as much nitrous oxide as possible and sitting there and breathing it for an hour, and then kind of coming out of it and kind of being handed two enormous great sort of green silk bags of nitrous oxide and inhaling them. And that's when he finally has his kind of breakthrough into an alternate reality that he describes really brilliantly.
It's so well done. But I guess, Mike, we should start maybe at the beginning, because this is very much a historical perspective of where it came from, I suppose, the ability, that, as you just described, actually, what they needed, what to provide the means, the engineering, the structure to have so much. So you start talking about Bastille Day in 1791 and how this sort of started the whole revolution in science that led to the discovery of nitrous oxide.
Yeah, I think it was kind of the story of the 18th century, really, was that people have been making more and more scientific discoveries, and there'd been more and more progress and more political progress, and people were looking forward to having more kind of social freedoms and being able to vote more, and not everything not being controlled by church and king. So there's this very kind of progressive uplift, and people starting the campaigns for the abolition of slavery and for the rights to vote and all these kind of progressive political causes. And the main character behind the nitrous oxide experiments, Thomas Beddoes, was very much, a sort of brilliant young scientist who was looking forward to this world where, everything was just going to get more progressive and everyone was going to be more free and more equal, and science was going to discover more and more wonderful things, and medicine was going to get better, and we were all going to live happier and happier lives. And then the French Revolution happens, and he's ecstatic, and in fact, a lot of British people are. But then in 1789, but then by 1791, it's become obvious that the French Revolution is not going to go swimmingly. And in fact, it's now all controlled by extremists and the Paris mob. And British culture swings very, very sharply sort of to the right politically, and everybody gets much more conservative and reactionary. So Bastille Day 1791 is kind of the moment when that really dawns, that Joseph Priestley, who's the sort of the discoverer of all these new gases, sort of oxygen and carbon dioxide and so on. His laboratory is burnt to the ground in Birmingham on Bastille Day because he's a sympathizer with the French Revolution. So it kind of starts at that moment when Thomas Beddoes has just got this amazing vision of the future, but he's suddenly awakening to the fact that it's not going to be so straightforward, and a lot of the world and a lot of society and a lot of the British mainstream is wanting to head in the opposite direction.
And so then how did Thomas Beddoes start in his career then? Because it wasn't originally with nitrous oxide.
No, he was, he's just an amazing character. He was kind of very short and incredibly fat and really energetic, and just constantly like this ball of energy, and kind of interested in everything and studied everything, and was just staggeringly knowledgeable, even as a young man. He was, when this story starts, he's teaching chemistry at Oxford, and there's very few people teaching chemistry at this point, and he's really into geology as well, and he's like one of the very, very few people who understands enough from geology to know the Earth is actually millions and millions of years old, when everybody else still thinks it was created in 4004 BC. And he reads, Greek and Latin, but also German and French and Italian, and he's translating all the medical literature. He's translating Immanuel Kant before anybody else in Britain even knows he exists. He's read all the sort of Rig Vedas and all the sort of Eastern spiritual sort of texts. He's just staggeringly knowledgeable, but kind of medicine has always been his thing. He's always thought that, what's the point of all this learning? The point of it is to make the world a better place, and what's the most effective way of doing that? Well, medicine, making people better. And so that's the kind of center of his obsession. So he's got all these other things spinning around. He writes poetry, and he's got all the different sciences that he understands, and he's really involved in sort of progressive politics. And so he's the So he's the sort of figure. He's teaching chemistry at Oxford, but Oxford is all very royalist and conservative, and he wants to escape from there, and that's why he ends up in Bristol, because Bristol has got a lot of non-conformist people and Quakers and dissenters, and that. It's really interesting, Bristol, in that way, because of course there's all the money, which is all about sugar and slavery, but then there's a whole other Bristol, which is where the campaign for the abolition of slavery starts, and all these sort of ethical societies, and that's Beddoes' world. And so having got interested in gas chemistry, he's also interested in the diseases. He's one of the first people to kind of really notice things like industrial diseases like miner's lung and occupational diseases, and he starts to think, I wonder if gas could be used for medicine. And because we swallow medicines and we apply them to our skin, but for lung diseases, and particularly tuberculosis, consumption as it's called then, which is the big killer. What if there was a new gas that we could use to treat this? So he, with his kind of progressive nonconformist sort of allies behind him, some of whom, like James Watt and Matthew Bolton, are very wealthy, he gets this research institute started called the Pneumatic Institution. And the idea of that is to synthesize all these new gases and to test them out and see if they have medical applications. So that's what he's aiming to do. But then, he hires Humphry Davy as his chemical assistant, and almost the first thing that they do is discover nitrous oxide and start inhaling it, and then the whole project just kind of takes off in a completely different direction. It's because it's experimental. He's always saying, experiments, you don't know where they lead. So he started off going, well, this was initially about medical therapy, but actually now we're studying consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, there is so many scientific discoveries that are almost accidental or non-intentional, and obviously I'm very biased being Bristolian, but I can see why he settled in Bristol, and it's interesting that the history was very much non-conformist even then. And so his circle that he created then in Bristol, you've got Humphry Davy. Who else have you got in that circle that he brought together there?
Yeah, he was kind of even though he was a doctor, he was not. He didn't like. He really distrusted most doctors. He thought that being a doctor should be about healing people and not making money. And at that time, the people who were doctors were basically doctoring for the rich. So he really wanted to heal the poor, and that's why he wanted to be in Bristol. But he needed to be somewhere that had rich patients as well, that he could get the money to do that. And so the network that he pulled together was mostly from outside Bristol, and there was an Irish peer called Richard Edgeworth, who was a great inventor, who became his sort of patron there. And then he collected all these younger people around him to whom he was like a real hero, both politically and scientifically. And there were the sort of young poets there, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey. And they started hanging out around at his place because he had these amazing all these amazing books and all this sort of German poetry and all the stuff they were fascinated in. And then Humphry Davy he brought in as his sort of chemical assistant, but Davy was also a poet, and he became best friends with Coleridge and with Southey, and other people like Dr. Roger, who we remember from Roger's Thesaurus, was a young doctor there, and he pulled him in as well. And there was sort of some sympathetic doctors and surgeons, and there were playwrights, and a lot of these people were also involved in political activity at the time, because there was a huge kind of political clampdown, sort of first war on terror against French revolutionaries, and so all the progressive Bristolians were all organising, to resist all these new government laws that were trying to crack down on them and ban political assemblies and so on. So he had a whole political network going, as well as his scientific and medical and poetic ones.
So much more multidisciplinary than the way we do science and medicine now, really.
Yeah, no, that's what I love about this story, because it's by the time that psychedelic science really gets going, there's this very big two cultures divide, and the scientists are doing in their minds the important science, and other people might be commenting or describing it, but that's not really science. But at this point, they're all involved and they're all kicking in, and when Humphry Davy starts getting everybody to describe their nitrous oxide experiences, it's all a bit ineffable and quite hard to describe. So the poets actually, contribute a great deal. And as Davy says, he's looking for what he wants. We have to develop a language of feeling, because we're trying to describe sensations and experiences no one's ever had before. So we need a new language for it. And that's sort of what Coleridge and Southey are doing as well with romantic poetry. They're trying to describe, thoughts and feelings and interior states that nobody's described before. So everybody's working on the same project together.
Yeah, it's really fantastic. Maybe we'll become a bit more like that, or we are becoming a bit more multidisciplinary with the psychedelic renaissance.
I hope so. I think so. I think it's opened up a new dialogue, and it's made people more aware that I think, especially within psychedelic science, you can't be so restricted to just being a scientist. You have to have a broader understanding of the social and the historical context. I'm not sure what you think, Mike.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, but I think the other thing is that with institutional science, it's very financially driven. The figure who I look at in the modern psychedelic renaissance and who really reminds me of Humphry Davy is Alexander Shulgin, because
Oh,
he was exactly the same. If you read his books, they're exactly like Davy's books. First of all, it's like, here's the chemical synthesis, and now here's the experience at 50 milligrams, and here it is at 70
Yeah,
milligrams. And I mean, it's in a way, Shulgin just rediscovered this what this protocol and this methodology and this reporting that Davy had come up with 200 years earlier. And I think the thing about Shulgin that made him different was he wasn't trying to make any money out of this. He
no.
wasn't trying to license his drugs. He wasn't trying to sell them to pharmaceutical companies. He wasn't trying to get FDA approval. He didn't have to obey all those protocols and jump through those hoops. So I think that's the thing in psychedelic science that makes it hard, is that it's just, I think, one way or another, everybody, whether they really want to be or not, is kind of in it for the money. And so you have to kind of obey all those rules, and then you have to have institutional papers that are properly accredited, and you don't want to turn in papers that have kind of contributors' names which sound like sort of weird psychedelic hippie pseudonyms, and you don't want to have like descriptions of your drug experiences in them. So in that way, I think psychedelic science is a bit constrained, sort of more constrained than this kind of science used to be.
and I think there's a conflict really between the use of plants for spiritual purposes. You talk a lot about mescaline in the last podcast, and that sort of protection and the use by indigenous people, and then this westernization of psychedelic medicine, and as you talk, FDA approval and randomized controlled trials, peer-reviewed publications, because we don't really know how to. Well, I suppose we learn from the past how you could do it differently, but somehow we can't anymore.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think I looked at sort of peyote and San Pedro and the mescaline containing cacti, obviously, and I was lucky enough to spend some time with the Comanche people in Oklahoma and kind of understand their, and peyote is part of their culture. It goes way back, and so in a way they know what it is before they even take it. They're going to a place, that all their ancestors have gone to. It's that sort of lineage thing, and we don't have that. We're kind of bootstrapping ourselves up and inventing it. But that's another reason why I really love this story about the discovery of nitrous oxide, is it's really about the Western psychedelic experience and the scientific tradition, and where that came from, and who the first people were to put all this together, and that was also something new. We didn't have any beyond alcohol. We didn't have any acculturated mind-altering drugs at that point. We've discovered them ourselves, and we have to I think the more we learn about our own tradition and where it came from, the better.
I'm just sort of thinking, so at this time, Nitrous Oxide UK, Bristol, was there anywhere else? Did you come across anywhere else in the planet where people were experimenting with nitrous oxide at this time, or was it just the kind of the Brits?
No, it was Joseph Priestley who'd first synthesized it about 20 years previously, but he hadn't inhaled it. He described it. He called it dephlogisticated nitrous air. That was what it was in Priestley language. He was the first person to inhale oxygen, and he described that, and he said, it's I inhaled this dephlogisticated air, as he called it. It wasn't yet called. It was Lavoisier who came along and said this is actually an element, and it's called oxygen. And Priestley said it makes you feel really good and kind of feel glowing and a lot of energy. And, if I put mice in a bell jar full of it, they live longer than mice just in normal air. So, this is great. This must have some principle of life in it. And Priestley also isolated carbon dioxide and created soda water. Which he didn't patent. He said, this should be, this is good for people and healing and should be free for everybody. But nitrous oxide, there was a American chemist who had said nitrous oxide is really toxic and possibly fatal, and it's actually the opposite of oxygen. If oxygen gives you more life energy, nitrous oxide is the sort of spirit of death and decay. And he'd probably actually synthesized nitric oxide, which is very caustic, kind of brown colored gas, which is kind of toxic to inhale. So I think for that reason, nobody had tried it. And Humphry Davy, when he tried it, said, well, this American guy says it's really toxic, but I inhaled a little bit and nothing bad happens. So, I'm going to claim this for my field.
And very brave of him, actually.
He was incredibly brave and quite reckless. I mean, he was a brilliant experimenter. He was amazing at designing experiments, and that's why he sort of isolated so many elements. He just knew exactly what you had to do, all the steps you had to do to prove that something was this or that. But at the same time, he was really quite careless experimenter. He was always cutting himself. He was always breaking things, and covered in sort of scars. And everyone said he's like a cat with 9 lives, and he's running through them really fast.
It's so much to do, I suppose. So much to get through. So, but early science really struggled, or was in conflict really with the church, it seems. And how did these guys navigate that difficulty?
They were outside all these Beddoes' network of who were mostly dissenters and Quakers and so on. They were outside the network. They were outside the Church of England. There were these laws called the Test Acts that meant that if you weren't a member of the Church of England, you couldn't go to a university, and you couldn't work for the civil service, and you couldn't have a government post. So they were very much outside of that circuit, and living in their own sort of community, often had their own churches, their own hospitals. It was, and when they were, particularly when the Industrial Revolution got going, a lot of them were quite wealthy. They became like a sort of state within a state, and they were all, none of them paid church tithes or anything, and they were as atheists as you could be in many cases.
And did they fund some of this science research? How did they fund all these experiments back then?
It was the Pneumatic Institution was funded by subscribers who were a lot of them from those sort of wealthy nonconformist families, like Wedgwood Pottery, for example. Josiah Wedgwood, his son Tom Wedgwood, was like a really close friend of Beddoes and a patient of Beddoes as well. And he kicked in a lot of funding, and they ran big funding drives, through their networks and stuff. That was very, unusual, because normally you go to the Royal Society and they'd put their imprimatur on it, and then you'd kind of go around, all the great and good and get funding. But there wasn't really such a thing before the Pneumatic Institution as a medical research institute. People kind of distrusted medical research. It was and experiment. Who are you going to experiment on? It was very unethical to experiment on patients. And most people's idea of experiment in those days was like, I guess it's a bit like, when we did chemistry experiments at school, where you're not actually trying to discover something new. You did the experiment just to show that, this chemical combined with that chemical did this. Experiments were ways of showing things that you already knew. So the idea of actual kind of freewheeling experiment where you didn't know what was going to happen, that was pretty new, and particularly in medicine. So we think of medical research now and that kind of institution as something that's always been there, but that's another thing that Thomas Beddoes and the medical institution were kind of inventing from scratch.
Yes, well, did it kind of set the foundations for medical research, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, not in his lifetime. In his lifetime, he was kind of regarded by the medical institution, well, firstly as a sort of political radical and revolutionary and, all that, but also he was thought to be kind of very, very reckless with all his experiments, and he was a bit of a maverick and a bit of a loose cannon. But the stuff that he proposed during his lifetime was stuff that got adopted by the next generation. He was very public health. He was really into, because most doctors weren't interested in public health, but infectious diseases and things. Most doctors were only interested in treating the rich people who suffered them. Beddoes was saying, look, infectious diseases have a reservoir, and it's kind of in the slums and it's among the poor. And if you want to get rid of the infectious diseases, that's where you have to do the work. And you can't really do that until we have like proper death registers with the causes of death and everything. And so he was advocating for all that in his lifetime, and that was all the stuff that transformed medicine, in the 19th century, in the generations after his death.
Okay. And is that also his role in, was it preventative medicine that he also was big in discussions for?
Yes, he always said preventive medicine gets ignored, which is, so it's interesting to read what he said about, infections and preventive medicine in the light of our recent experience, because he says the trouble with preventive medicine is, it's so much more efficient, to stop the problem from happening in the first place.
Yeah.
But the problem is that when it's successful, then people don't appreciate like the work that it did because you don't see it. And when it's not, then it's like, well, it's failed, so everybody has to understand, and you have to do proper cost benefit analyses of how much it costs to stop diseases from spreading in the first place. And, things like, he spent a lot of time touring around Cornwall and Shropshire, where he came from, where people lived in houses with tiny little windows and kind of fires, so they were just living in smoke all the time. And they were doing it because it was everything, there were howling gales outside and they were trying to keep their heat in, but it was like, people need to get ventilation in their houses better. That's why everybody's got all these terrible lung diseases.
Yeah, horrific. So just I want to talk a minute about the women. So there's not a lot, I guess, because of the time, about women in the book. But what about these guys' wives? Were they interested in what? I guess that would be the way women would get involved. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Were their wives interested? Beddoes' wife, Anne, for example, or?
Yeah, no, and she was an early, member of the experiments, and she inhaled her green silk bag and loved it. Had a wonderful experience. Beddoes was very unusually attentive to women and women's rights for that time. He was the first person to teach a course of medicine for women in Bristol, because it was always felt that it was indecent subjects and women shouldn't know about it. And but he kind of went ahead and did that. And when the experiments started, he said it's really important we have an equal sort of representation of the sexes in these experiments. And but it turned out to be very male dominated, because a couple of women had kind of really bad experiences, having kind of like sort of nausea and going into sort of almost comas and sort of feeling very weak and faint. And then there's another woman who kind of did what a lot of the men did, which is inhale her sort of green silk bag of nitrous oxide and then just go off on like a real manic one and kind of rush around a bit and sort of dash around the houses and the streets and come back and not quite remember what she'd done. And that was the sort of thing that if you were a man, you could easily do it. You know, it was,
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things about the experiments, because they were always witnessed, you know, people watched you kind of inhaling your green silk bag. So there was a moment of extreme public disinhibition, you know, where who knew what you were going to say or what you were going to do, or, you know, what kind of sort of strange poses you were going to strike, or sort of antic activity. And, you know, that was easy enough for men to kind of laugh off, you know, a little bit of loss of dignity. It was all in the interest of science, but it was much, much harder for women at that time. And, you know, it was, you know, they were much more exposed. And so that's interesting, because that's something that carried on, you know, when psychedelic science got going. It was very, very male dominated. And, you know, people like Erica Dick have shown, you know, how, of course, all these kind of great male scientific pioneers all did these experiments with their wives, and their wives probably contributed a large amount to it, but they were somehow never on the research papers. And, you know, all the great culture heroes, you know, Aldous Huxleys and Timothy Leary's and Gordon Wassons. It's kind of, you know, there aren't any women there. You know, it's sort of, there's something about that that's kind of, you know, made the experience. I mean, even though I think at a grassroots level, I don't think sort of psychedelic experience is particularly gendered. I think in the way, in public representation, it definitely is. And you can kind of see from the Pneumatic Institution's experiments that even like with a real will to kind of, you know, put your thumb on the scales and make sure that there are enough women being represented, it just didn't happen.
It's really interesting that Beddoes wanted to have as many, you know, equal numbers of men and women in his experiments, which is actually something that we don't really do now. We've kind of lost that. And so Beddoes was so ahead of his time, wasn't he, in, you know, being very interested in preventative medicine and, you know, looking after people in the slums and that sort of where you need to start with your medicine, as opposed to treating the rich people. So does he, you know, in the medical curriculum, actually I've not done medicine, so I don't know, is he should kind of be up there, shouldn't he? People should learn about him to start with, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he's a great figure, and the answer is no, he's not really there, because you know, the one thing that you know, he always said, you know, somewhere in the gases there's a medical breakthrough. You know, there's kind of one of the great triumphs of modern medicine are going to come from, you know, the gases that we're experimenting with. And you know, all the sort of orthodox doctors didn't believe him, and you know, he died kind of, and, you know, and everybody said in his obituaries, oh, it was a failure, he's been what a wild goose chase. But then, you know, 30 years later, suddenly anesthesia comes along, you know, and Humphry Davy did write in his book, you know, he said one of the things about nitrous oxide is it extinguishes pain for the duration, so it could be very useful in surgical operations. So actually, you know, he did come up with this, you know, great defining triumph of modern medicine, but he's never credited with that, because all the credit goes to the people who developed it in the 1840s. And he's, I think that's why I think he's a fascinating figure to dig into and recover. He's very accessible for a historical figure for our generation, because basically all his politics is kind of like our politics. You know, his progressive medicine is like our progressive medicine. He's really approachable and easy to understand, but he's just he's in the history of medicine, he's not a famous figure.
But you are changing that, aren't you, with this book, which is great.
Well, I hope so. I mean, Humphry Davy has been the famous figure of all this, you know, and if you go to Penzance, there's a huge statue of kind of Humphry Davy looming over you. And but then he went on, you know, to become the president of the Royal Society and the great sort of, you know, scientific sort of, you know, icon of his generation. And in the process, then Beddoes, whose project launched him, sort of faded into the background. But yeah, it's interesting that it's the people who are really familiar. It's like Coleridge as well. They're the ones who kind of went a bit more kind of conservative in their old age and kind of rejoined the British cultural establishment, and they're the ones that we've heard of. Whereas people like Beddoes and Tom Wedgwood, who were the sort of progressive revolutionary figures who stuck to their guns, for some reason they kind of, you know, don't loom so large in our history. I mean, go figure.
Yes, good point. Yeah, very good point. So Giddy, we haven't really talked about him very much. So he was very much sort of a collaborator. He worked a lot with Beddoes, did he?
Yeah, that's right. He was Beddoes' student at Oxford, and then Beddoes went down to visit him in Cornwall, which is where David Giddy came from, and he became kind of got roped into local politics there. He had he has a different story kind of with the after the French Revolution, because he's also a revolutionary, but he's in this very kind of, real Cornish backwater, and because he's been to Oxford, he's a, sort of local dignitary, whether he likes it or not. So he has to soft pedal his revolutionary views and kind of grit his teeth. And the other thing, of course, is he's just down there and somebody says, there's this extraordinary young boy in Penzance who seems to have taught himself chemistry from nothing. And, that was Humphry Davy. And it was, Davy is just incredible. I mean, there's nobody in Penzance who knew anything about chemistry, but he'd got hold of a copy of Lavoisier. He'd got someone to read it to him in French. He kind of found an old in a shipwreck on the beach, he found, I think it was an old enema tube, and he'd sort of pump, and he kind of converted it to, pump out a vacuum and demonstrate, that sort of how heat can be generated in vacuums. And he did all this as a teenager. And so it was David Giddy who said, wow, I think we should connect this person with my friend Dr. Beddoes. And then and he kind of proposed him to Beddoes as his chemical assistant. So that's all. But I mean, they're all such interesting figures, and they all wrote and corresponded to each other so much. You can really get, into their thoughts and how they were handling the politics and all those questions that we all have of, like, how politically involved and exposed do you get, or, do you kind of, are you more effective in society if you conceal your political views? And, they all have different approaches to this. And David Giddy, I think, is, he's he's the opposite of Beddoes, who is always incredibly excitable and enthusiastic. And Beddoes is Giddy is very, very slow and kind of steady, and actually ends up being an MP, and actually ends up being president of the Royal Society himself after Davy.
But potentially without Giddy, they wouldn't have met, Beddoes and Davy.
Oh, no chance. No chance they would have met. I mean, all that was available to Davy in Penzance was being, sort of apprenticed to the local apothecary. And then, with any luck, he'd have had, maybe his own chemist's shop, and he'd have been a respectable sort of member of Penzance society. That was the highest he would have got otherwise.
That's fascinating, isn't it? Those sort of, it's not a coincidence, but those sort of small things that happen that make in your life, that make such a big difference.
The butterfly effect.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yes. But then also you wonder how many Humphry Davies and geniuses kind of ended up just being chemists in provincial towns because they never got that break.
Yeah, so true. Yeah. How many people sort of missed out on that. So you kind of said, that it wasn't in Beddoes' time that they started to use nitrous oxide as an anaesthetic. So it was sort of a wee bit later that these big innovations happened, I suppose. And they started using it for dental surgery, is that right?
Yeah, it's such a great, weird story. I've sort of joined the dots a bit in Psychonauts and followed it up. But because of Davy becoming successful and Robert Southey, the poet, becoming poet laureate, then the nitrous oxide experiments got quite well known in Britain, but not as, not in the medical and scientific world, but more kind of the poetry and the fact that these young poets had kind of got off their heads on this gas, and it's quite quickly kind of called laughing gas. So it really made its first appearance in sort of music halls and variety shows. So by the 1820s, if you go and see, a show with lots of, different magic acts and different performers, then there'll quite often be a laughing gas show. And that's like someone comes onto the stage with a big tank of nitrous oxide, and people come up on stage and inhale some, and then kind of, have a funny turn or do something weird or sort of recite some poetry. It's a bit like sort of those stage hypnotism shows. You kind of suggest to people, who knows what's going to happen to you, what you're going to do, we're going to reveal your inner self. And those became very popular, and they became very popular particularly in the States on the carnival circuit, where you could go round and play a new town every night for years, and people had never seen it before. So quite a lot of people toured laughing gas shows, and including Samuel Colt. That's how he got the money to make his revolver, was he was a laughing gas entrepreneur. And then dentists in the States started to notice that sometimes people, when they'd inhaled a lot of gas and were stumbling around, would like sort of whack their shins really badly and seem not to feel any pain until the gas wore off, and then they'd notice that they'd really hurt themselves. And that's always the limiting factor for dentists, is people don't want to put up with the pain, so they started using laughing gas in dentistry. And that was the beginning of what became anesthesia. And then people realized you could do the same with ether, and then with chloroform, James Simpson, the great Scottish doctor, kind of developed chloroform. So and the word anesthesia was coined to describe this. And it was it still took a while for surgeons to get into. I mean, the demand for this really came from patients and not from surgeons. And I think even if Beddoes and Davy had totally set themselves to going around convincing surgeons to use nitrous oxide in surgery, they wouldn't have got anywhere, because at that time surgeons, they just noticed that patients had a better chance of surviving surgery if they stayed conscious. So you wouldn't want to have like an inflammable gas reaction going on in your surgery and your patients passing out. It didn't really make any sense to them, and it was a long time before and part of it was surgery got more complex, and the ability of the patient to resist pain for longer surgery became more problematic, and that was a lot of the reason that anesthesia was eventually adopted.
I mean, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, so much of what Beddoes and Davy and all their circle are about is pleasure and pain. They're so fascinated by pleasure and pain, what causes pleasure and what causes pain. And that was the fascination of nitrous oxide for them. It was like suddenly, the brain, who knew, has a great big red pleasure button that you can press, with a lung full of gas. And, and that also seems to switch off the pain. So, their whole goal in life was to create a world with less pain and more pleasure.
Seems like a really good plan to me. And you think if surgeons would want people to not be moving, when they're operating on them?
Yeah, and the ethos was it's partly religious. There's belief that pain is the sort of came from God, and we were supposed to put up with it and go through it. And I mean, I guess that survives a little bit still in midwifery, and that sort of branch of medicine. There's a bit of like it's sort of pain meds are disapproved of, and it's better to kind of go through it sort of without them if you can. And that was just the feeling of surgery in general. It's like the surgeon has to be really skilled, and the patient has to bring the courage, and between the two of us we'll get through it.
So what was what tipped it? What kind of was the changing point to try and get anesthesia accepted? I know you said it was the patients, but how did they push for change?
It was the first Horace Wells was the first dentist who started using it, and then after that, various other people who'd been connected with carnivals and laughing gas shows started setting up nitrous oxide practices, and then he had a friend who was tried to do the same thing with ether, and eventually persuaded a surgeon in Boston, Massachusetts, John Collis Warren, said, "Okay, I'll do this surgery with ether," and he kind of set up. It's still called Ether Day, and the place that the surgery happened is called the Ether Dome. It's all in Massachusetts General Hospital, and it was particularly in America, because America hadn't had like a great sort of modern medical discoveries that became kind of emblematic of the new nation, and so that Americans really pushed it, and then the British surgeons kind of resisted for a bit. Robert Liston, who was like the great British surgeon at that time, called it a Yankee dodge. He thought it was a bit sort of, it was a bit sort of typical American gimmicky nonsense, and but eventually people started to realize, that it gave the surgeon more time at the operating table.
Yeah.
And I didn't know about the history about the nitrous oxide shows. I'm just reflecting on Bristol, at least 10 years ago, that you could have laughing gas bars in certain nightclubs growing up. And obviously now that's just not a thing. And I think abroad you can still have that in certain clubs. So I can see how, like, historically, it would also be very popular.
Yeah, and I think it's because getting all the kit together was expensive. It's not the sort of thing you have at home, a gas tank and all the tubes and everything. But if it's your business and you're doing a show, then once you've done, after the initial outlay, it's quite a money spinner. And this is exactly the same with you can, if you're selling your balloons for £1 each, that's enormously profitable because they're only costing pennies. And that was the business model. And it was something about it was a good thing to do in company, and with sort of it became a thing that everybody would take turns and have a go and make an idiot of themselves, and it was kind of it was the fun night out, and so I think there's the modern adoption of laughing gas is shouts back to that quite a lot, and also back to James Watt's green silk bag, because nitrous oxide was around in the 60s, but you had to have a huge, great tank. And, also if your tank has an inhaler on and you pass out inhaling it, then you die. It's really, really dangerous. So that happened a bit in the 60s and nobody went there. And it was only when, the little canister and the little balloon came along, which is in a way a sort of harm reduction sort of administration, technique. If you can't really kind of if you pass out while you're doing that, then the balloon falls from your mouth and you start breathing normal air, so it's it massively reduces the risk. And that's and that again, that's the technology that James Watt came up with in 1799.
Yeah. And I guess the effects wear off pretty quickly once you stop.
Yeah, they did. And that's another interesting thing, I think, about the Pneumatic Institute and those first nitrous oxide experiments, is that people's first experience is amazing and sort of mind blown. But, even by the end of that year, let alone the next year, it's kind of, people are a bit over it, once you've done it a few times, and people start saying, well, it was amazing the first time I did it, but now not so much. And so it's got this shape that I think we recognize from the rest of psychedelic science, of things start off with amazing discoveries and incredible possibilities, and then people get very carried away with the potential and the sort of miracle cure, and then it doesn't quite deliver it. And it's kind of that happened in the 50s and 60s, I guess, that people so it was going to be the cure for schizophrenia and it was going to do everything. And then 10 years later, people were starting to say, how much longer is this miracle cure just around the corner? And again, we're having to sort of grapple with that again today. So it's very interesting that the very first psychedelic science experiments have exactly that pattern.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, we need to look back to history much more than we do, I think. And this book, well, we're nearing the end now, folks. This book really is going to help people do that. I mean, Hannah, we learned so much reading this, didn't we?
I really did. I mean, I'm a bit embarrassed by my lack of knowledge before reading it. You just not.
You and me both.
Yeah, I mean, you're really, really not taught it. I'm just thinking back to my undergrad, unless you choose a history of science module, which I did do one of. And even then I didn't learn this at all. So I think people are going to really enjoy reading it, because there's nothing really out there for people who want to understand some more context in terms of Western science.
No, I mean, I never learned it at school, and history of science is mostly pretty dry.
Yes.
But you know, such interesting people, such an amazing story.
You describe them as
Absolutely.
characters. It's a really enjoyable read because it feels like you're reading a story. Because you really get to know each of them and the relationships with each other, which is actually kind of also one of the more enjoyable bits as well of reading the book. Kind of really getting to experience that and see those sides to the people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the sort of intimate details, and the way you describe Beddoes, you get such a clear picture of him, really, don't you? It's great. I highly recommend it to folks. Yeah, and one thing I really loved. So Davy invents the Davy lamp for miners, so they can see better, so that they'll be much safe. It's all about their safety, isn't it, for their welfare? And of course, this is abused by the mine owners. You explain this really well in the book. So they use this as an excuse to send their miners deeper and into more dangerous places, which, yeah, so who benefits from this brilliant innovation to keep people safe? It's, it's a little bit like today, isn't it? Who benefits from AI? The tech bros and, so I just thought that was a really nice, really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's interesting about the Davy lamp. That is, of course, the thing that we all learn at school
Yeah.
or, in the history of science. But the reason it's so famous is because it was actually really hard to kind of show that science was kind of making technological developments, and Davy spent years kind of experimenting with things and making scientific discoveries and kept saying, oh, this is going to be really useful in industry and, but it never really was. And then the Davy lamp was just like showed that if you had a fine enough mesh, then, when there was flammable gas, the flame wouldn't ignite it. And he did that in the lab and then it turned out to work. So then that's why the Davy lamp is so celebrated, because it's this kind of great story about the application of science to industry. But the reason it's such a great story is there were so few examples like that.
Yeah. It's a fantastic example, actually. And that's there's quite a lot of that sort of thing in the book. It's fantastic. Lovely. So thank you very much, Mike, for coming and talking to us all about
it's been such a pleasure. Thank you both.
Oh, thank you very much, Mike.